So, welcome back to Drinking with Historians. I'm Matt Gabriel, professor at Virginia Tech, and for those of you who have who've joined us, who've been joining us all of the weeks, you will have noticed that you are not experiencing deja vu. Dr. Jamie Goodall is joining us yet again. We had an unfortunate power outage in the last time this happened, and so we're so fortunate that Dr. Goodall was willing to come back, and we're doing this re-record so that we can have her questions and put it up on YouTube so that more people can enjoy the conversations that we had. What we customarily do is we talk about what we're drinking. So I am drinking today, I'm just having a very simple rye old fashioned with some old Overholt rye. Very lovely, just a little bit of simple syrup to sweeten it up. It seems kind of appropriate because it's, as opposed to the thunderstorm, which was happening last time we were doing this, it's nice and sunny and delightful outside. So I figured I would match the mood of that. So Varsha, what are you drinking right now?
I am drinking Hudson Whiskey's baby bourbon, neat, just because I had a scotch last night and I was like, no, let's just go stick with the really hot weather and drink something more refreshing. Scotch is more of like a winter drink, which oddly enough is frustrating because I like it year round. Yeah. What are you
You're
drinking?
gonna hear my dogs.
Nice. What are you drinking, Jamie?
So I am drinking a Paloma tonight. It's the working man's drink. So I figured my research deals with working men, so it was appropriate.
Nice.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering correctly, so Paloma, is it a tequila-based drink?
It is, yep, tequila and grapefruit juice.
So yes, very refreshing too. You must be having nice weather. So yeah, not really a winter drink, not like scotch, like Varsha was saying. No.
Yeah. So like I just, speaking of like working men, I think what I'm interested in is like I've ordered your book and I'm really excited to read it, mainly because you just talked about working men. My interest is like, why did you decide to study pirates, and specifically like, are pirates like a transformative part of the labor force, or are they more on the sidelines in the period that you study? And like, how'd you decide to stick with pirates?
Well, thank you so much for buying my book. It's sort of interesting how I got into piracy. I'd like to say that I was always interested in pirates, because that would have made me sound really cool. But the reality is, it wasn't until my master's program, I took a European imperialism class, and we were able to write on any aspect of European imperialism we wanted to. And I had come across a quote in one of our readings that called Sir Henry Morgan England's second Drake. And I was really curious about that comparison. So that's what I wrote my paper on. And when I was applying to PhD programs, the woman who had become my advisor asked me if studying pirates was something that I thought I could do long term, if I thought I could make it a dissertation. And I come from a very blue collar background. And so thinking about pirates as very like lower working class individuals, that seemed like a really good fit for me.
Yeah.
So I have like 30 questions right now because I'm a simple medievalist, and so none of this stuff makes sense. Also, partially because most of what I know about Sir Francis Drake comes from playing the Civilization video games, where he's kind of, this iconic kind of privateer. But the other thing too is that, in a lot of kind of pop culture representations of pirates, like, I don't get the sense that pirates are kind of blue collar. Like, I think of them, and maybe it's just because of kind of the image of the, the tri-corner hats and stuff like this, that they're more aristocratic. Like, so how does that square? Like, how are they blue collar, I guess?
So most pirates, they're coming from, they're your average sailor. They're typically coming from the Royal Navy. They're disaffecting or mutinying from the Royal Navy. They're leaving their merchant vessels for poor treatment. They work in some sort of maritime industry to begin with. And so that's really where, for me, the blue collar imagery comes in, because they tended not to be well off. I mean, you have individuals like Sir Francis Drake, you have individuals like Stede Bonnet, but by and large, a lot of these individuals are coming from very little.
So it's really a distinction between kind of the popular representation of maybe like the upper crust, like a captain or something like that, But maybe that's a question. Like maybe I'm making an assumption. Was there a class difference between the captains of the ships of these pirate ships and the ordinary sailors there?
Um, according to some of the, I'm sorry.
That's
According to
okay.
some of the articles we have, pirate captains were actually voted on, so they were equivalent to the rest of the crew.
Really?
Yeah, and if you listen to Marcus Rediker, sorry guys, I don't know if you can hear them or not.
Yeah.
My husband is power washing the deck, and they're going a little nuts. So, but Marcus Rediker makes the argument that they're really egalitarian in nature, and that they're equivalent. The part of the reason that they joined these pirate crews is because they wanted that equality. They were tired of the way that their captains were treating them on board their merchant vessels, or they were tired of the way that officers were treating them on board the Royal Naval vessels. So they joined pirate crews with the intention of being equal, and that's where they voted on how to divvy up their loot. They voted on who's responsible for what, and they were voting on who the captain would be, and the captain really was there just to guide them through their engagements or their battles. Hold on a second. I'm gonna go see if I can quiet them down real quick.
Not a problem. Right now and okay.
It's so cool to think of piracy as like partially democratic, because all the representations I've seen of pirates in movies, like not just Pirates of the Caribbean, but even like Captain Hook, all the way in like Peter Pan, you see these captains as more tyrannical, and like the crew really doesn't have a lot of choice. So I was just wondering, when it comes to like pop culture representations of piracy, like what do they get wrong most of the time, and what do they get right, and like what is like the biggest myth you want to dispel about piracy?
So most of our stereotypes about pirates come from the 1950s feature film of Treasure Island. So
Yeah.
Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The 1950s version really played up a lot of the stereotypes that Stevenson wrote about in his book. In particular, the way that pirates talk. Of course, they would have talked just like any other sailor. They're coming from different ethnicities and different nationalities, so they would have been speaking multiple different languages. And so talking like a pirate is probably one of the biggest myths. But this is also where we get the eye patch, the peg leg, the parrot as a pet, those sorts of myths as well. And so I feel like for the most part, pop culture gets a lot wrong because they're relying so heavily on those stereotypes. Pirates didn't dress any differently than your traditional sailor would have dressed. They didn't talk any differently. They acted in much the same way as your average sailor, because they're sailing around for extended periods of time trying to find ships to attack. So there's not a lot going on for them most of the time. So they're passing their time on the ship gambling and carousing and drinking and stuff like that.
So I just totally lost my train of thought. But one of the things that stuck out, I found it, is you mentioned about different languages that were spoken. So I think that another thing that kind of comes from maybe pop cultural representations, right, is we think of pirates as kind of homogenous, right? Like they're all dudes, they're all kind of swarthy in complexion, like they're muscular, they're all white. Like is that a fair representation, or is that another thing that kind of pop culture is kind of inculcated in us that we need to break out of?
I think part of that has to do with pop culture, but part of that has to do with just the records that we have and whose records we use to tell the story about pirates. A lot of pirate scholars for a long time had relied very heavily just on the English language resources. And so we know about the very famous English pirates like Stead Bonnet or Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, but you had pirates coming from Wales, you had pirates coming from France, the Netherlands, you had African pirates, so you had pirates from China, Japan, Korea. I mean, you had pirates from all over the place.
So and Go ahead, Varsha, if you're going to ask a
Yeah,
question.
I was just wondering if crews themselves are diverse, like not just on separate ships, but like on one ship. Like, for example, in the colonial United States, would you see African American pirates or African pirates on a white ship or a ship that has predominantly white pirates, or is it all homogenous on one ship? And I think my second follow-up question to that is like, how does one become a pirate generally in the colonial United States?
Yeah, so even on board ships, they tended to be fairly diverse. I'm sure some ships were quite homogenous, depending on where they were taking sailors from, like what port they were in. But we do know, based on the evidence, that you know, you would have English pirates and French pirates and African pirates all on the same ship. Now, this is not to say that pirates were necessarily the most progressive people by any means. Typically, they were taking who they could get, but also they had a very complicated relationship with slavery. Some pirates would free enslaved peoples when they came across them. Others treated them as any other commodity. So whenever we talk about pirates as being very egalitarian, I don't want to portray them as necessarily progressive in that way. They were still very much men of that time. So, and as far as becoming a pirate, like I said, sometimes it happened through mutiny. You might be on board a Royal Naval vessel or a merchant vessel, and you mutiny against the captain or officers. You might be recruited in a tavern or on shore from your maritime industry. You might mutiny on, or you might be shanghaied. So you might be captured when you're drunk.
Oh no.
So, and sometimes you were impressed into service. If your ship was attacked by pirates, they might take you prisoner and force you to work on board their ship. So there are many different avenues to becoming a pirate.
So just like the Princess Bride, right? The Dread Pirate Roberts, like Wesley, like that's a historical document. You heard it here on Drinking with Historians.
Yes.
So another, I mean, like I'm really interested in, and I think, and again, I think we all confront this as historians, is that this kind of black and white image of the past, in which everything is very simple, right? We think of pirates as homogenous, or we think of, you know, the Middle Ages as, you know, dirty and unkempt and out of learning or something like that. And, you know, one of the things you keep talking about, and I think one of the things your book does so well, is it talks about kind of heterogeneity. Like not all pirates were the same, not all ships were the same. We shouldn't say, you know, it's almost problematic that we say like pirates as if that was one thing, right? Because there's all sorts of different ones. And in fact, your book focuses on pirates of the Chesapeake, right? Which is very different, I think, than a lot of modern conceptions, which we think of kind of the Caribbean, you know, around the Bahamas and stuff like that. So, like, how did Pirates of the Chesapeake, how are they different than kind of you know, pirates further south?
In many ways, they operated very similarly. Their main purpose, of course, is still to disrupt commerce. They just stuck to the bay, and they tended to have much smaller vessels than perhaps other pirates might have had, because they are sticking to the bay and the inlets and islets, the rivers. Their focus really is on the everyday commercial vessel. It's true that pirates in the Caribbean would also attack your average commercial vessel, but their hope was to attack a Spanish treasure galleon. That was, of course, the ideal. In the Chesapeake, they had no grand illusions that they were going to attack some sort of treasure vessel. So there's that. Also, you have such a mix of people throughout the Chesapeake, because slavery does play such a large role in the region. So you have enslaved peoples who are forced into service on board these pirating vessels. You have free blacks who participate. You have pirates who free enslaved individuals and allow them to join their crew. So slavery is one of the major areas that's affecting the Chesapeake in terms of who joins pirate crews, what their role is, and what their impact is.
Sure. And then what about gender too? I mean, one of the things we always think about kind of pirates as men, but I'm guessing that's not the case.
No, some of them, two of the most famous pirates are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. But there's also one of my favorite pirates is Qing Shi. She was a Chinese courtesan who married a pirate captain, and upon his death, she took over the I think it's the Red Fleet. So she took control of his entire pirating operation. So we do know that women participated in piracy. It's impossible to know just how many women participated, because both Anne Bonny and Mary Read, for example, disguised themselves as men on board the vessel. The only person that knew that the two of them were women was the captain, Jack Rackham. So women, unfortunately, will never know just how important a role they played on board pirate vessels, but I would like to imagine that far more women were pirates than we tend to think about. But if anything else, too, women are playing important roles because pirates had wives, pirates had families. So they're holding down the homestead while their husband is participating in piracy.
That's something you really don't think about, right? Like giving him a kiss at the door, like good luck on your pirate adventures, honey. Like
Exactly.
we'll be here.
I guess my question is, where is like the law in all of this? Is our colonial law or British officers or other countries like law enforcement, are they successful in catching pirates, or are pirates themselves like largely successful in evading the law? Or is like law still evolving and like keeping pirates at bay?
Yeah, I would say that the law was forever evolving and trying to capture pirates. Of course, they had laws against piracy, but then war breaks out, and that's where privateers come in. Really, the only thing that differentiates a pirate and a privateer is perspective and a letter of marque.
Yeah.
And a lot of those privateers then turn pirate once the war is over because they've lost their job. A lot of colonial governors, in particular, throughout the islands of the Caribbean and even the eastern seaboard of North America, would use pirates to their advantage. So they relied on pirates to help bring in goods to their respective locations that they might not otherwise have gotten, or provided them at a much cheaper rate. They're bringing enslaved peoples to these islands and to these colonies. Sometimes they provided protective services. So whenever some of the English colonies, for example, the English islands, they would write to the crown and ask for protection against Spanish or French incursions, but the Royal Navy would be busy elsewhere, so they would hire pirates to sort of protect the island. So for a long time, pirates were able to elude the law, or evade the law. And it's not until, I would say, the 1720s, 1730s that we really see a concerted effort, a multinational concerted effort to stamp out piracy, at least in the Atlantic. So pirates were able to operate for quite a long time with very little restriction.
That's such an interesting idea that these guys, these pirates were kind of mercenaries in a way, and they would be more than happy to kind of rent out their services as kind of, in a sense, like mafia or something like that, right? Like just kind of like, yeah, it'd be terrible if your galleon went down, but we'll protect your trade if you want, or your area, since the Royal Navy isn't around at this time. So I had a question too. You mentioned letters of marque, as distinguishing kind of formal privateers from piracy or something like that. Like I guess my question is specifically about that, but more generally, like do these letters of marque survive? And then more generally, like what kind of sources are available? Like, are these, in the case of, for example, in a lot of medieval things that I work on, is that we have a certain type of source which often presents one particular side, and then we have to try to read through that. But do we have diary? What kind of materials do we have from pirates themselves, or is that stuff around?
Yeah, so we do have letters of marque that have survived. They
Okay.
typically denoted which nation or nations you were able to attack, made note of how the loot would be divvied up between the governing officials and the privateers and whoever the owner of the ship was. So it was a very specific document. As far as records that pirates themselves leave, most of the records we have tend to be colonial office records. So they're more government level records.
Okay.
But we do have the pirate trials themselves. So we get a lot of information about depositions from different pirates who turn on each other. We have the trial transcripts that give us some insight into their activities. For me, material culture is a really big way that I like to engage with source material. So Texas A&M's nautical archaeology program did an underwater dig at the part of Port Royal that's fallen into the ocean from the 1692 earthquake. And so I wrote a lot about the glassware, the shape of the taverns, and the way that the space was designed. So trying to look beyond just the official government sources, because it's really hard, because pirates, of course, aren't leaving behind detailed notes of their daily lives, no ship's logs or anything like that.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, you mentioned material culture. I mean, that's something I think a lot of historians have been confronting, certainly in the last 20, probably more than that though. But this kind of material turn in which we're moving away from just kind of talking about sources and stuff like that, and incorporating and working with archaeologists, like you were saying. Like, has that really transformed the way we understand pirates? Like having that access to that material?
I think so, yeah, because it helps us to better understand their physical activities, like where they were going and what goods they might have had on board. Helps us to better understand how they altered their ships to suit their purposes, especially if they're taking a ship from another person. They might refit that ship to better suit the types of activities that they're undertaking. So I think archaeology and material culture has definitely helped us out a lot in that regard.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether or not, so, we talked about pirates like in the Chesapeake and their relationship with slavery. I was wondering if there is like an end point for piracy, or like a transformation in like the 19th and maybe later centuries, or has it generally not stayed the same, or has it disappeared? What is when does piracy, as Robert Louis Stevenson would look at it, or even as you would look at it, sort of end or change?
Yeah.
I would say it didn't really end, but it did change. I would say in the 1730s, we see a big shift from piracy in the Atlantic to piracy occurring in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. So it really shifts focus geographically, but they're still operating in the same way. They're attacking merchant vessels. They're attacking the Mughal emperor's treasure fleets. They're attacking land, like different cities and towns along the coast, and ransacking them. So they're operating very similarly. I think we really see sort of a decline in piracy there in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I've focused more on the Atlantic world side of things. So my research tends to end around 1750, 1790. But I do think that piracy continued on even after the 19th, early 20th century. I mean, we know there's pirates today, right? They're just
better at their jobs.
Yeah.
And less revered.
Right. They're less revered. There tends to be fewer of them.
So why do you think that, I'll let Matt go real quick, but why do you think we do have this image of pirates as revered? Kids want to dress up as pirates, we have these amazing stories about Blackbeard and certain famous pirates, and treasure. Is there a certain gendered reason that we want to revere pirates, specifically a certain type of pirate, or do you think there's another reason that we do that?
I think a lot of it has to do, even contemporaries sort of started to revere pirates. I think a lot of that comes down to Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of Pirates, which was a bestseller of its day. And then, of course, I think books like that were coming out where it told the exploits and really played up it was very Hollywood-esque in the ways that Captain Charles Johnson described the various exploits of these pirates. He's the one that gives us the very clear description of Blackbeard as, this big towering man with a thick black beard twisted up with matches and saltpeter wicks that were spuming and, all that sort of stuff. And so I think between that and pop culture like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, those things really endeared pirates to the public.
So we're running out of time, but since it's a doer, we can go a little bit later if that's all right with you, because I have two questions. Two big. I don't know if they're big questions. They're really interesting to me, so I'm going to subject you to them. So I'm sorry.
Okay.
Anyway, is there any relationship between piracy and whaling? because you know the dates don't match exactly, but especially if you're talking about kind of merchant ships in the Atlantic. I mean, pirates must have encountered whaling ships, right? Like, is there anything about that, or is that just a weird nothing?
I mean, I could see the two being interrelated. I mean, because
Hmm.
I tend to view piracy much more broadly than others do.
Okay.
For example, I know some who view smuggling and piracy as two distinct ventures and they don't see any
Oh.
overlap between the two. But I find that I think the two overlap quite significantly. So I could see
Huh.
where piracy and whaling might overlap in that same way, where pirates might participate in whaling in some way as a means to make money.
Yeah. Well, I was even thinking like if they raided whaling ships, I mean, because whale oil was a valuable
Yeah.
commodity, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
that would be something that they could sell. So I guess the other question is just like, so what are you working on now? Like, you have this book out. Like, are you staying with pirates? Are you like what's going on in your research right now?
So I have two major projects that I'm working on right now. The first
Ooh.
is a bookazine for National Geographic. Um, the bookazine is going to be on piracy and shipwrecks, and it'll come out in April of 2021. And then I'm
Oh,
working,
cool.
yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's when National Geographic reached out to me, I was like, really? You want me?
I know Kid Me is like super excited right now.
Yeah,
So
shipwrecks are my favorite like artifact of like history. Like I've never actually seen a shipwreck, but like whenever they're on TV or like I'm reading about them, I'm just like, this is like the coolest thing.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about that project. And then I just got a contract with the History Press to write a second book for them. This time I'll be focusing on piracy in the mid-Atlantic. So I'll be looking at New
uh,
Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware specifically.
okay,
Interesting.
I will refrain as a native New Yorker from making a joke about New Jersey right now, but there we are. So anyway, I think that is about half an hour. That is about our time, unfortunately. So thank you so much for A, for joining us for the first time, B, for doing this again, because I feel like we kind of cheated and got you twice, you know, to learn, you
Yeah.
know, even more about pirates and your amazing work. And I'm so excited about your new projects, not just, you know, the book, but especially the National Geographic thing, which just,
I'm really
yay, I'm
excited
so
for that.
excited. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then before we stop recording, I just want to let everyone know people should buy J.B. Goodall's book, Pirates of the Chesapeake Bay, from the colonial era to the Oyster Wars. I cannot wait to get my copy. It is really cool, and I'm very excited to read it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Jamie, and
Cheers.
for me and Varsha. I guess we'll end this by saying cheers.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.